And today we have three amazing speakers. I think I mentioned in the email, really three great speakers that I really respect, and I'm really in awe for all the work they do. So we have Newell, Leslie King, and Robert Newell with us, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves. And I'm Nancy Prévost-Maurice, education specialist at Railroad. So Anne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you, Nancy. I think I'll pass because it says it up on the slide. So Leslie, do you want to begin introductions followed by Rob? And
Sure.
You know what? I have a question. Who is your favorite animal? And I'd like to draw your attention to the word, I use the word who and not what.
Thank you, Anne. Hi, Carolyn. Hi, Shelley. Hi, everybody I know on this call. We have a wonderful audience. And I think before I start introducing myself, I'll ask you to let us know where you're coming in from to this call and what your interest is in this subject. So just type it in the chat box and dog, my best friend. My dogs tend to interrupt. Hi, everybody. Around. Wonderful. Wales. Good. Excellent. Okay, I'm Leslie King. I'm a professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability, and I'm the program head for the Masters in Environmental Practice, a new program that I'm very excited about called Indigenous Environmental Leadership Pathways Program for Indigenous students with all Indigenous scholars teaching it. And finally, the Science and Policy of Climate Change, which I introduced a couple of years ago, is now about to start its third cohort in that. And I mention that because, of course, I'm extremely concerned with climate change, as are all of you. But it's the biodiversity issue that keeps me awake at night. And I think that causes me some ecological grief. So I mainstream biodiversity in all my teaching and research. My main interests are in biodiversity governance and biodiversity justice. More about that later. And I'll be keeping an eye on the COP15 for the Convention on Biological Diversity that starts a week from today, right here in Canada, in Montreal. I think I'll leave it there and get Rob to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Newell. I've been around at Railroads for a while, but more recently started as a Canada Research Chair in climate change, biodiversity, and sustainability. So the stuff that I do is really, as Leslie was talking about, high concerns around climate change, high concerns around biodiversity. These are very, very interlinked issues. So this is a lot of what I work on is ideas around integrated planning and policy. How do we understand climate change issues and also approaches and strategies towards mitigation and adaptation within a constellation of a whole variety of social, environmental, economic factors, including the critical biodiversity imperative and issues. So I'm actually currently doing some research. I'm in the Comox Valley right now. We're doing a research project that takes this integrated planning lens. And I'm just going to maybe sneak peek preview it right now. The image in the back is related to this research project. We'll probably talk about it a little bit later in the webinar. But for the meantime, I want to just maybe address the favorite animal question. So do I have a favorite animal? It's a bit of a tough one, but I am definitely very fond of wombats. If you're not familiar with a wombat, I highly recommend looking them up. They're an Australian marsupial. They look like a mixture of a gerbil and a tank. When I lived in a long time ago, I was doing work in a conservation overseas, and I lived in a wildlife sanctuary in Australia, and I had a little wombat friend who I went with jogs. We went on jogs together in a little enclosure, and they're very, very interesting creatures. They have this big cartilage plate on their rump that they use for defense because they like to burrow, but also apparently it's involved in mating. And I'll leave it at that because, you know, maybe that's an inappropriate topic for a webinar, but yes. Big fan of wombats.
I forgot to answer your question, and mine is, it doesn't require as much explanation as Rob's, but it is, of course, elephant. And I raised 2 baby elephants while I was living in Africa. And they are the most wonderful creatures. And I often say that it was the most loving relationship I've ever had, including with 2 husbands.
I can relate to that. So before I say what my favorite animal is, I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm working from the Algonquian territory. I'm very privileged to be living and working on these magical lands, which contain a lot of rivers. And of course, the Algonquians are famous canoeists. So that brings me to my favorite animal, which are loons, because I'm an avid swimmer, and the call of the loon in the spring heralds that the ice is going off the water. So thank you very much. And then Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees ancestors and families. It is with gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. Welcome, everybody. So I have lived with dogs all my life, and to be quite blunt with you, the dogs made my life so much more enriching and enjoyable. So biodiversity and other critters have always been an integral part of my life. However, the latest report from the World Wildlife Fund is very alarming, the Living Planet Report 2022. It says that, you know, we're entering the 6th mass extinction, and that is because of us. Land use change is the biggest threat. We have certainly learned what encroachment on wildlife brings us, COVID-19. And unless somehow or other we can start conserving more space for the other critters, we are going to continue to encourage, we're going to continue to encounter more pandemics. There are 6 key threats to biodiversity conservation: agriculture, hunting, logging, pollution, invasive species, and climate change. And that we've really got to start looking at where are the biodiversity hotspots and making them an immediate priority. We have, but I don't want to be a downer for you. There are some really tremendous things happening. Nature positive net zero loss for nature, regenerative sustainability, which is all about needing a nature or net positive goal to restore, regenerate nature, and not simply halt its loss. And as Leslie mentioned, we have the United Nations meeting in Montreal in December to agree to a new global framework for biodiversity. So I'm going to, and I think linking global trade to impacts on nature is going to be a key issue that they should be discussing. So before we begin though, Rob, you're the new Canada Research Chair on, I always get it mixed up, biodiversity, human health, and sustainability, is it? So could you please discuss the intersectionality that you see in your Canada Research Chair agenda?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, first off, I guess I'll get the actual research chair name. So it's climate change, biodiversity, and sustainability. When I present that to folks, you know, the first reaction that most have is that that's a really broad, large umbrella, right? And very, very much so. But really what it speaks to at the core components of it is sort of that and sustainability piece is really, that's where it's saying that you have to explicitly look at the linkages between these issues. And you're talking about kind of things that make folks hopeful, you know, some areas of progress. Some areas that I've actually seen that there has been progress is that, it has been becoming clearer and clearer that people are understanding how interlinked these issues are and are taking systems perspectives, right? You saw that in the recent Living Planet report. They put climate change front and center as saying that this is inseparable from the biodiversity loss issue. Saw in the recent IPCC reports too. Interestingly, they really explicitly linked in the vulnerability sections around issues between climate change, ecosystems, and then connected that with health itself. So that kind of leads me to sort of work that we're doing, which is the idea of trying to work with communities, doing community-based research to create systems-based tools to figure out if you do a particular strategy, what does it mean with respect to these things that we have to think about, these things that are imperative. So shifting to the side here, as I was mentioning, I'm currently in the Comox Valley. So we're doing some workshops using this framework of the CBH Nexus, climate change, biodiversity, and health. The idea is to apply this to different planning and policy areas. In this particular case, we're looking at food systems, exploring different food system strategies and see how they might align or conflict with climate adaptation and mitigation goals, biodiversity conservation, and health. And we added that health component because it is this idea that it really kind of brings in sort of the social sustainability pieces, because it's not just physical health, it's also human health too, or sorry, mental health, I should probably say, right? So then when you start looking at those intersections, you can see that there's a lot of linkages. Part of the language that we use in this is when you create systems maps, are trying to look for co-benefits and trade-offs. Definitely and trade-offs. It's not all win-win. If it was all win-win, why aren't we doing this and winning all the time? It's you got to kind of understand that there's those adverse effects. But just as some examples, some climate action strategies that could be considered integrated. And I'm going to kind of throw this more from the transportation sense, but let's say you had a policy planning that involves some very extensive, ambitious riparian buffers, buffers around riverside streams, going beyond just sort of a recommended 30 meters and going to like 100 meters, saving some for active transportation pathways, but also having areas that protect those freshwater ecosystems. When you have high stormwater runoff and you might have contaminants in there, it's a protection area. It allows for connectivity of ecological systems, and also is really good for climate adaptation, because you are in a lot of places going to see these high rain events, and you do want to have that stormwater protection infrastructure, like a buffer there. So it's using those sort of lenses, you can kind of understand where strategies fit within a broader constellation, not using just a narrow view. And that's sort of what we're doing. But in this case, we're applying it to food systems in the Comox Valley.
Okay, so I wonder, Leslie, could you explain a bit more about nature-based solutions and give us some examples?
Sure, we have somebody on the call, Carolyn, who just did her master's thesis on nature-based solutions. And one of the major talking points about the COP in Montreal will be nature-based solutions. And this is really focusing on how our biodiversity initiatives can help us address climate change. And these are things like protected area networks, indigenous protected and conserved areas, and a whole plethora of, as Rob was just detailing, of methods that rely on nature as solutions both to biodiversity and climate change. I was just going to say something about your question. I'm sorry, I probably didn't answer it fully, but
well, no, that's great. I'm going to come back to you on protected space.
Actually, can I just say something?
Go ahead.
That I loved what Rob was talking about the Comox Valley, and what Carolyn did in her thesis too, which was really focusing on biodiversity and nature-based solutions at the local level. So I tend to be very focused on international agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity. But of course, it's at the local level where the rubber hits the road, where we're destroying biodiversity and where the impacts of that come home to us. So I think it's really important to link the local and those global initiatives, which are necessary because global biodiversity is about 50% of what it was 10 years ago. So we're destroying it rapidly. Anyway, go ahead. You were going to ask another question.
Well, I want to make a comment, if I may, dear colleagues. So to me, nature-based solutions are a perfect example of what we mean by net positive benefits through regenerative sustainability. So for example, and you know, it's a win-win, you know, although Rob, you mentioned trade-offs, I do think it's possible to get win-wins. And for example, in the verges, those areas between two multi-lane highways, where if you plant it for natural vegetation, it brings back biodiversity, and it doesn't cost as much to maintain it because you don't have to keep it plowed all the time.
I just saw the planting, the verge planting in England, where they saved something like 25 million bucks from not having to mow the lawns on the verge.
I know. And then there's another place in Europe where they've planted rooftops on the bus stations, and that's attracted bees. And so we have to learn to live, I think, with the other critters. Rob, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here, actually, because one of the things I think, and when people are trying to wrap their head around what nature-based solutions look like, an example I love to draw to is the Arcata wetland. It's in Arcata, California, Northern California. They have a wetland that they set up for tertiary wastewater treatment, right? So it's going through the final stages of wastewater treatment. It's a wetland that can process things like nutrient pollutants and other pollutants that are in there, but then also becomes a bird sanctuary, and there's also wildlife trails around there. So now you're actually starting to see those linkages that we're kind of seeing in this Venn diagram behind me. But one of the things is when people are sort of saying like, okay, a bit fuzzy, what does it actually really mean? Well, you'll actually probably notice that a lot of nature-based solutions are really based on habitat provision. And this is important because one of the major things to think about, and Leslie, I know you might want to talk about the extinction hippo, but I really like this acronym, so if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind jumping in there. There's when people are trying to figure out and get a sense of what are the big challenges, what are the big concerns around biodiversity, the extinction hippo is a very good way of being able to understand this. It's a cute acronym, depressing in content, but basically you're looking at the H is habitat loss, I is invasive species, P is pollution, and we could put carbon pollution there too, climate change. Another P for population, so that's sort of kind of like almost an accelerator factor of all the other pieces. And then the O is like overconsumption, overharvesting, that sort of thing. But and as you pointed out in the recent Living Planet report, that land change, habitat loss is always the largest of the bunch. That is like the most critical issue for biodiversity. So when you start looking at nature-based solutions, a lot of it is actually just restoring that habitat. Restoring habitat connectivity is really about creating like homes where biodiversity, functional diversity, ecosystems can thrive.
Yeah, rather than restoring, Rob, I would suggest we use the word regenerate, because you can't ever go back to an a priori state, right? You always are moving forward because of our interventions. Leslie, over to you.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to explain that I stumbled a bit when you asked me about nature-based solutions. Carolyn knows why. I just had a big discussion with some of my First Nations instructors in my program about why First Nations were so opposed to nature-based solutions. And they are moving beyond that now, but that's why I sort of clutch up when people talk about nature-based solutions as the be-all and the end-all. As with everything else, Indigenous peoples have often been at the wrong end of the stick of nature-based solutions. So, for instance, of people trying to plant plantations of same species as a climate solution on their territories. And so once again, the Indigenous people have our progress taken out on them. However, at COP27 in Egypt, The First Nation, the Indigenous participants made a wonderful presentation on nature-based solutions. But basically, it was a plea for us to recognize that they are the leaders in nature-based solutions, not us. They are the ones who've made the successes with Indigenous protected and conserved areas, tribal parks. They have done a way better job of protecting ecosystems and species than we have. And in fact, in some ways, they're the only success stories that we have, although Rob pointed out some others, and they are there. I just read about an Australian study that looked at bat habitat in Australia. And when bat habitat was destroyed, the bats had to disperse into smaller groups and spread out to find less good habitat and less good food in residential areas. And that was asking for bat to horse to human transmission of disease. And so that was a direct link between biodiversity loss and COVID-19 or other viruses. So I thought that was a fascinating. And so one could say that if you protect bat habitat, that is a nature-based solution to pandemics.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. We have a observation in the chat room that Lula in Brazil is making a whole ministry designed for Indigenous people leadership in the Amazon forest. So let's move to, so the biggest threat is habitat loss. Somehow or other, we think we can keep developing all the spaces and we'll still have biodiversity. All of those critters that we grew up with. That's not going to happen. There's Harvey Locke has an organization, Nature Needs Half. And I think I really like the image of that nature needs half if we're going to conserve biodiversity. The federal government has committed to 30% protected areas by 2030. My environmental organization argues that indeed we need 50% protected areas by 2050. Now, there's also this new thing. What is it? Indigenous protected areas. Leslie, do you want to comment on that, please?
Yes.
And Rob after? Yeah.
Yes, I've been very engaged with Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And the key thing about them is they are Indigenous led. And a wonderful example are the people I worked with here on Vancouver Island, Chloe Quiet, sorry about my dog, who declared their traditional territory. This is not their reserve. This is land far beyond their traditional territory that goes all the way up to the summit of Highway 4, the Kennedy Lake watershed, and declared it a tribal park. And some of that tribal park they actually zoned that area so that some of it was for ecosystem protection. Nobody could go there. It was to preserve wilderness. Some of it was zoned for human use, but sustainable, you would say regenerative human use. And some of it was zoned as economic development zone. So they have a zip line, they have a mini hydro project. And so that would never have happened if Parks Canada had designated all that as a park. And it would have been less sustainable as a result. So today we have about 144 Indigenous protected and conserved areas across Turtle Island. And many of those are vast areas of the north that I now have confidence are being managed by Indigenous people in a much more sustainable way than we have ever managed them when we've allowed mining and all kinds of resource extraction into those areas. Sorry, I could go on forever about IPCAs and I'll stop there. I think.
Rob?
Sure.
Thanks,
Yeah. Leslie, I think Leslie presented it very well. I mean, some of the things that maybe just add or perhaps even just build on previous comments. We're talking about how certain approaches are are not necessarily win-win. One of the things that is really important to put forward, and I have a postdoctoral researcher that's working on this right now, looking at some of these are systems perspectives, not just necessarily in terms of co-benefits and trade-offs, but also who's actually being impacted. Some people get, some groups and communities are impacted much more than others, right? I mean, there is this sort of old school thinking of, well, let's do the Yellowstone, just, carve off an area, put some boundaries around it. But as Leslie indicated earlier, that sort of a approach can be extremely exclusionary and quite harmful to a lot of Indigenous communities that have developed long-standing relationships with that territory, that land, right? So there is some harm in there. And then there's also this kind of like the outcomes piece, right? It doesn't actually, some studies will even show just because it's a protected area doesn't mean you have larger species richness, right? There's, different metrics of biodiversity, richness, and abundance, but there are some studies that kind of show that, just having this area that's, basically boundaried off doesn't naturally mean that you are going to have a whole wider variety of species. Leslie, you shared a paper actually a while back that looked at, some areas that weren't necessarily protected, but were considered like undeveloped, were actually found to have higher species richness. Maybe not the same level of unique species, but what it's going to show is that we can't have this sort of like, maybe overly Cartesian view of just saying, okay, this is where our biodiversity spots are going to be. Let's just basically quarantine it, and then it will happen, and it'll be fine. And then this is where our human spots are going to be. You actually have to kind of think it a little bit more holistically, and really just kind of understand that biodiversity exists everywhere, and there's different sort of models and approaches for doing it. And just the kind of like carving off, leaving it alone, so to speak, but allowing tourists through is not necessarily always the best way forward. And in some cases, it can be quite harmful to communities that have relationships with those lands. And
in fact, a comparable survey found that Indigenous peoples across the globe really control huge, vast lands with high biodiversity. And this study showed that those Indigenous managed lands actually had higher biodiversity and better so-called management. They wouldn't like me to say that, but than the so-called protected areas that we have. So this is my great hope, to tell you the truth. And people talk about biodiversity justice. The COP15 is going to be talking about safeguarding the rights of Indigenous people. And we talk a lot about climate justice, but we haven't really begun to talk about biodiversity justice. But this is way more than justice. This is reliance on the leadership of Indigenous people to get us out of the terrible situation that we're in, where we're really threatened with biosphere collapse, and certainly biodiversity collapse in many ecosystems, marine ecosystems, for instance.
I'd like to make a link back to poverty too, that Rob mentioned, in that, have you ever noticed in my work in more vulnerable communities, one of the first things I noticed, because I live in the bush most of the time, and so I'm very I noticed, and it's something we noticed when we were at COP15, Leslie, in Paris, how few trees there are. There's manufactured landscapes, but in very, very poor neighborhoods, there is such an absence of greenery and trees and gardens, and you can juxtapose, wealthy neighborhoods and how the profound difference there is. Because I also believe that besides the health connections and everything, that biodiversity brings beauty into our lives. And the more we can regain our connection to beauty, perhaps the more we will appreciate the need for conservation of biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think there's a very strong point around the equity issues, and when you're kind of looking at this through a social justice lens, I mean, you can sort of see probably one of the clearest and maybe like starkest examples is to look at these spaces, as Anne, you're talking about, that might not have the same sort of greenery, right? And perhaps maybe then, if we'll put it in kind of like really sort of economic terms, the property values are are lower and more accessible. But really what you're also seeing is you're seeing a confluence of like a couple different vulnerability factors, right? So thinking about exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, people with lower economic means are going to have harder times adapting to things like this urban heat effect. Yet at the same time too, also living in places where urban heat is going to be more acute. So yeah, I mean, it's we're getting into kind of that sensitive, tricky zone of like you make this is sort of the gentrification argument, where you make a neighborhood more pleasant, then all of a sudden it's only accessible to folks with the means, right? But that's really what we got to think about. How can we make communities where we don't necessarily have these quote unquote unpleasant places, right? Can we actually create networks of green systems that extend throughout communities? And we actually wrote a paper on this in response to the pandemic too. This idea of trying to look at green space networks in terms of connectivity, things that like weave throughout systems that allow for both human interaction with nature and actually, benefit from those microclimates that come from that stormwater management comes from it, that access to green space that does wonders for mental health, also access to green trails, but at the same time too, allow for a connected green network that also allows for that ecological connectivity through the communities. And if you kind of use a connectivity lens, then no longer you're just saying like, okay, let's just have like a gross amount of hectares of like green space. You're actually kind of doing it a bit more strategically and actually thinking at it through a social ecological perspective.
Leslie, you're muted.
So, and can I take us in a just slightly different?
Of course. This is our space.
This is something that you and Rob have heard me talk about quite a lot. I have an hypothesis that if we address climate change, we're not necessarily addressing biodiversity loss. But if we address biodiversity loss, we are probably also addressing climate change. Well, lo and behold, the IPBES, which is the IPCC of the Convention on Biological Diversity, it's the group that generates the science. Although we're way behind the IPCC, we've only had one report. But the IPCC and the IPBES had a meeting to share the connections between climate change and biodiversity loss. And lo and behold, they made this as a scientific product of that meeting. They made this wonderful chart that ran down all of the proposed targets for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which will be decided upon at Montreal. They listed all those targets, and then they listed the impact on climate. And so the ones that had the most positive impact on climate, they put in green, and they had a light green and an orange, and et cetera. But it's astonishing because if you look at that chart, it's almost completely green. So almost all of the biodiversity targets will also address climate change and will have a positive impact on climate change. Now, I love that because, one of the main differences between the response to climate change globally with young people, with protests, et cetera, we've really not got there with biodiversity. The awareness out there is not great of biodiversity. And, we really relied on the scientists to create that awareness of climate change. And they did a wonderful job through the IPCC reports, but also through many other NGO and young people protests, et cetera. We really raised the awareness. However, we're not there yet. And in fact, for biodiversity, the scientists didn't even have an awareness of what the true situation was, that we were actually losing species at 100 to 10,000 times the amount of background. And the scientists still have to catch up on biodiversity. So this awareness that addressing biodiversity will also address climate change, I think is really significant. Sorry.
No, I agree. But okay, so I'm going to pose the elephant in the room question. So with biodiversity loss, there's no second chance from extinction, right? It's gone. So IPCC began its deliberations, if I'm not mistaken, in 1995. I don't think we can wait that long. What do you think?
Yeah, well, the IPBES only got started in 2012. And they were both created at Rio in 1992. Both regimes were created.
Oh, I didn't know.
But biodiversity was very slow off the mark. So the one and only IPBES report was published in 2019. And whereas, we've had all these different reports from all the different working groups of IPCC, we've been flooded with them. We're so far behind on biodiversity. So,
Right. No. How do we accelerate then? That's why my environmental organization is pushing it. Can we get a worldwide movement, or even just in Canada, for a push for protected spaces everywhere? But then we bump up against politics, because in Canada, for example, it's mainly agreeing to protected areas is provincial jurisdiction, not federal jurisdiction.
yes, well, all resource decisions are provincial. And this fragmented constitutionality is really getting in the way of Canada acting on biodiversity.
I like that term, fragmented constitutionality.
Well, it's true.
Yeah.
But, mainstreaming, I use the word mainstreaming when I talked about my teaching, but mainstreaming is one of the big goals of COP15, is to talk about how we can mainstream biodiversity into all government decision-making and all governance actions. And it's a real problem, because yes, if you come to the table, the expression in biodiversity circles is, if you're not on the menu, you get eaten. But it's true even of mainstreaming. So the WTO is the International Trade Organization. And if we put the biodiversity regime up against the WTO, we get eaten. So mainstreaming is good, but it also has this terribly dangerous flip side that will be outpowered by trade and finance and business and all of those self-interests that have opposed. I mean, the US is still not a signatory of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Why? Because the interests of the military industrial complex from my hippie days outvoted it. And so we've never been able to get the US at the table. And they're eating us instead of us eating them. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
on biodiversity.
No, I definitely understand the So, I mean, I'm going to go back to a comment that I made like towards the early parts of this webinar. One of the things that I do think that's happening that is actually quite good is that both IPCC and other groups like WWF are like basically talking about these as inseparable issues, climate change and biodiversity. And there is sort of an importance around this. There are certain things that are happening that may not actually use specifically the language of biodiversity, but are kind of showing people where things were, what might have been confusing, or where they might have misunderstood the importance of it previously, right? So if we're going to go back to earlier days, the rationale was, let's do the charismatic megafauna. Let's promote the ones that people like. If we save the habitat of these large creatures, then, we're going to save the ecosystems too, right? Unfortunately, that kind of, it missed the mark on what actually biodiversity is and what it actually means in terms of an ecosystems and systems perspective, healthy watersheds, healthy nutrient cycling, the ability to have like vegetation that allows for microclimate regulation, good water cycling, those sort of things, right? These are the types of things that we're missing the mark by just showing this single species. Like, the more cynical would say, like, yeah, I think polar bears are cute, but I could probably carry on without them, right? And that's part of the problem. That was like the messaging was a little off there, but now, and you talked about regenerative sustainability, arguably this is getting like more attention in the agricultural world prior to my recent position at Rural Roads. I was at the Food and Agriculture Institute at University of Fraser Valley, and it is a term that is coming up more and more, and it actually has sort of like tangible practices to it. People are still trying to wrap their head around what exactly it means on the ground, but there are sort of like an understanding of what they're actually trying to do is regenerate, create a healthy environment, because you can't necessarily have a healthy food, well, you can't have a healthy food system without a healthy environment. You know, just in the conversations that we had around looking at some of our systems and what does this mean within the CBH nexus here, one of the things that really came up to about it is like, yeah, sure, these are great systems nodes and a variety of social, environmental, economic factors, but you know, the core piece that will cause cascading effects is if we don't have healthy freshwater systems, I mean, this all sort of falls apart, right? So that's the linkage between human health and healthy habitats, right? So, I mean, I think part of the problem is like, at least from my days, and I also worked in environmental NGOs, so I did this sort of thing, but like that sort of single species communication approach, kind of that was done before, I think you're kind of confused the public really about what it actually, why it's actually important and how it operates within our world.
And we have something like 201 statutes on the books in Canada across the provinces and the feds, and they're so fractured. So for instance, the Migratory Bird Act, we had a lot of species agreements, and those are all still on the books. And those are coming up against the more ecosystem-based approaches. But it's still so fractured. There's no coordination. There's no leadership, shall I say, on that coordination. And we have such a long way to go before we can have coordinated action in Canada for biodiversity, which is why I congratulate you and Carolyn and all the other people who are working at the local level, because like climate change, in the absence of strong federal leadership, we've got to work at the local level. However, in this case, we also need to work at all levels, and it needs to be coordinated.
Yeah, the critters don't respect man-made boundaries, but there are tremendous gaps. For example, a friend of mine from university is now a federal court judge, and he made a ruling out west on a rare species. And he has essentially said in his ruling that we were schizophrenic because yes, this particular bird was endangered, but we had no idea of the critical habitats needed to protect it. Right. So he said, you can't have one without the other. Yeah. So that gets back to integrated planning. And there's a comment from Carolyn in the chat who says that integrated approaches are clearly critical.
Yeah. Thanks, Carolyn. And by the way, speaking of which, Nancy, will we be saving the chat? There's some wonderful information in the chat.
Will do, yeah.
Thank you. That will be great. And I think we should pay attention to the chat and see if there are any questions that need answering, because I realize we've gone on. We've only got 15 more minutes.
Yeah, there are no questions in the chat so far. I've been trying to moderate, but Sabrina, you're right. It's probably not the precise term, but sometimes when I'm moderating, things just slip out. So
no, it's a terrible.
If I've offended anybody, I can't think of a better term right now off the top of my head.
But certainly divided or fractured, but
or fragmented, or
schizophrenia refers to a disease, a very unfortunate disease, and we shouldn't be using it. That's quite right. Thank you, Sabrina. Okay, with lots of good information in the chat. Carolyn, you've given us some good.
I guess unless there's another point I wanted to bring forward, and you mentioned something that I thought was kind of an interesting comment that would be worthwhile to present here. One of the challenges I've often seen working with local and regional governance is that our administrative boundaries, as you mentioned, critters don't necessarily see our administrative boundaries, right? And there's a big mismatch between ecological geography and our administrative geography, right? And what kind of needs to be more of a focus, and I think what would really help would actually have more powers to watershed level governance, right? Even though watersheds are porous as well, it does actually have just much more of like kind of a logical geographical area to be able to understand like how humans and ecosystems integrate and live with one another and work with one another. Over here, like in the West, I mean, a lot of it's sort of happening kind of through the NGO sector that are working with local governments. And there's often a friends of sort of thing, right? You know, friends of Millstream Creek, friends of so-and-so, right? Now, I definitely doing some work around landscape connectivity in Ontario. I like the idea of the Conservation Authority because of the watershed level works.
Fraser Basin watershed.
Yes, and there are definitely, yeah, exactly. And there are definitely more powerful groups that kind of work in that sort of, what's the term that you used to use, quasi-institutional governance
intermediaries,
yes.
Yeah,
that actually have that sort of level of power. And yeah, I mean, I would like to see more of those for sure. And I don't know, like my understanding too, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Conservation Authority powers have kind of had some sort of challenges over recent years as well, or am I, this is just kind of word about,
there's a huge dispute. So our dear premier is committed to affordable housing. So you know what his plan was? He's now clawing back from conservation authorities protected areas. We're losing large swaths of green space and biodiversity. And he's claiming this is all for affordable housing, but they've just discovered that a lot of his business acquaintances knew about this happening and bought up some of these land rights prior to his announcement. So there's major controversy here. Whereas in Edmonton, the government there, you know, it's so simple. They addressed affordable housing by infill zoning in already developed areas. So this brings up the whole question of, you know, we value developed land versus raw land. Everything is developed. You grow through development. So that's another whole issue. But there is a question, and this is a hard question from Miriam in the Malcal, incorporate biodiversity protection into your work.
Sorry, or like, are we just as kind of maybe sort of a follow-up question, are we looking at biodiversity protection within just our work generally, or people's work, or like specifically our research?
I think it's work in general, not
work
necessarily in
okay.
research. Yes.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
I mean, that's what mainstreaming is all about. We have to, and that's what this COP is all about. It's about changing our relationship with the natural world. And I hate to use those terms because it separates us from the natural world. But that's the goal, is to live in harmony with nature by 2050, which is a bit absurd. But you know, we can only do that, Miriam, if we raise everybody's consciousness. And everybody knows in their heart of hearts that we rely on the natural world for sustenance, for food, for psychological security, for about everything in our lives. And yet we have never really articulated that as a purpose of governance, for instance. Or we'd be in a very different space right now. So I think that one of the main ways we can incorporate biodiversity into our work and our lives is educational. We just have to bring everybody along. We've got to raise consciousness of these issues before it's too late, which it almost is. Sorry, I don't want to be negative, because I think there are lots of really good things going on, but it's too little too late in my view.
Yeah, no, you're always negative and positive. You're a realist, Dr. King.
Oh, I've never been a realist.
I want to bring up something, and I can't, I don't have it at my fingertips. And it gets back to something Rob said, it's connection. We have to feel as connected to other species as we feel to our families and to those we love. Do you recall the picture, I think it was in The Guardian, of the gorilla in the arms of its handler, and it was dying. And the face of both the gorilla and the handler, the grief was exactly the same.
Mhm.
And that picture has stayed in my mind. And I wish I could share that picture with everybody right now. I just don't, I can't multitask as well as I used to
Mm.
when I was younger. But I think if we can, again, you may think it's kind of naive on my part. If we can somehow communicate, and I've used a lot of it in my social media research and strategies, the beauty of nature and the power of nature and other species. And that's where I have hope through reconciliation, is because of the indigenous value that's placed on relationship to land. And I think fundamentally it's all about regenerating relationships with life and other living beings that I think is critical to our humanity. Somebody said in the chat, this gorilla video broke me. I saw the exact pain from both of them.
Mhm.
Thank you. You've said it much, much better than I. It was just a powerful picture.
Yeah. Ndakazi, mountain gorilla, dies in the arms of her caretaker.
Yes.
Mm.
Oh my God. Yeah. Thanks, Wendy.
You know, it's so yeah, I mean, I'd like to kind of take a stab at this question as well too. And I'm probably going to take a little bit of a different angle around this, right? I'm thinking two things that come to mind around you know, jobs, where you work, and how you incorporated biodiversity thoughts and conservation biodiversity efforts into your what you're working on. What is this sort of the new regenerative sustainability framing does have some value in that, you know, there is this concern that we're coming up with just, you know, another word for sustainability, but really the core of it is actually trying to go thrive rather than just bump up against limits, trying to go with the idea of regenerative. Is there things that are kind of contributing to restoration of habitats, right? Now, we're starting to see a little bit more linkage between climate change and biodiversity in these large reports, and the way that it's coming into more larger discourse. You kind of, a lot of the students that we bring into the Science and Policy of Climate Change program look at ways of like, how do we do climate action within our office, within how do we incorporate it within the work that we do in both our private and public sector. You can start thinking about ways that could work also in the biodiversity world too, right? And this could be things in terms of like, where are you sourcing products from? This could be things in terms of like how your business company operates within the immediate surrounding environment. Does it actually work within a development that offers other green space, or has like space for other green space around there too? It's still a bit new, but I mean, I don't actually see why we can't just take the same sort of approaches to a company trying to do things towards climate mitigation, and then apply it to biodiversity. Leslie said earlier that biodiversity conservation is going to be a core component about what we do in climate action if we do it effectively. So, I mean, that we could just almost kind of take the same sort of lens and say, like, what is our company, what is our government departments and institutions doing that that relates to biodiversity? Is it contributing, or is it bumping up against it? I think there is opportunities to be able to do that, and I take that perspective there. So yeah.
Did you see my beer suggestion?
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. Yeah, Leslie's just responded to a question in the chat.
That was a great response, Rob. But Tanner wrote saying he's executive chef for a brewery, even though he's got a BSc in environmental engineering, which is needed in a brewery. But he wanted to know what to do. I'm sure you'll all have wonderful suggestions. Mine was that he name beers, new beers. Is it beer or beers? Anyway, deer or deers, after endangered species or endangered ecosystems.
Okay, I'm happy to jump on this one. There is
I thought so,
the
Rob.
brewery one is actually one of the examples I love to use most in classes around industrial ecology. There's this system that was created by a group. I don't think they're still called this, but it was a Zero Emissions Research Institute a while back, and they came up with this sort of industrial ecology system for breweries, which basically looks like at the idea of where, from industrial ecology, you think about where your outputs become inputs, right? So in this sort of model that they had there, they had spent grains that could become substrate for mushrooms. And then after the mushrooms break it down a little bit, then you got good hog feed. The hogs end up producing manure for your anaerobic digester. And then some of that manure could also go into nutrient ponds, which then produce some algae that feeds into fish ponds.
Breweries. It's great. Yeah.
It's sort of it. Yeah. So when you're kind of basically creating systems that are low waste systems, trying to go towards no waste, basically modeling them off ecosystems, you're doing a couple things. You're diversifying your products, you're reducing your waste, but you're also offering other products rather than them being kind of imported from other places that may not have the same sort of ethic or value or approach to it, right? So, I've had questions about interesting questions about how things like vertical agriculture, does that actually have any relationship to biodiversity, right? We're currently working on a paper saying it could, but it only does it in certain conditions, right? So vertical agriculture could have a relationship to biodiversity if you can create systems that have diverse products, not just, hey, we're producing lettuce in a small space. It could actually have a relationship to biodiversity if you have policies that say that people that start creating vertical agriculture farms in urban or smaller spaces are also compensated for land and create easements on it and create habitat. So there are sort of creative ways in order to things that might not seem obvious for biodiversity or conservation off the top of your head. You can start thinking about those linkages when you take the broader systems perspective. So I know that that was I really got excited there, but yeah, it's.
I actually think it's the question that's important here, Miriam.
Mm-hmm.
Ask ourselves that question and think of what we can be doing in our everyday lives. That is what's important.
Yeah, that was a wonderful example, Rob, and I really do hate to wrap this conversation up.
Yeah, me too.
But I'd like to thank Leslie, and I'd like to thank Rob and everybody in our audience for your interest, and hopefully we can all carry this commitment forward and do something for biodiversity conservation in our work, in our everyday lives, and how we tread more lightly on the earth. And I'd also like to thank Nancy very much for always well organizing us. Thanks, everyone. Be safe.
I'd like to thank all our audience who gave some wonderful suggestions. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Anne.